Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi and today I'm here to bring you the mid-year book Freakout tag. Perhaps Smash Mouth said it best when they said, the years start coming and they don't stop coming, because this is what 2021 has really felt like for me. And perhaps it's because I've blocked out most of last year, but this one in particular feels like it's flown by faster than any other year in living memory. As it is, we have reached and breached by this point the middle of 2021, so it's about time for me to do this booktube staple of a tag. I'll leave the creators of the tag, Chami and Ellie, linked in the description box below, along with the tag questions if you want to do your own version of this video. But for now, I think it's best if I just get started. Question number 1 is, what is the best book you've read so far this year? And shocking literally nobody, my favorite read of 2021 so far has been Witch Shadow by Susan Dennard. This is the 5th book in Susan Dennard's Witchland series, following Sophia and Isolde, two best friends and witches who may or may not be the mythical Car Awen, a pair of witches of legend whose powers from the ether and the void, as opposed to the 4 cardinal elements, are destined to restore the magical balances of the Witchlands as a whole, as the various nations that make up the Witchlands approach the end of a 20-year truce and war appears imminent. By this point in the series, the story has grown far beyond one that just follows Safi and Isolde, and spans a variety of witches from a variety of nations, all of whom we've gotten to know and fallen absolutely in love with throughout the series of the story. Though Witch Shadow does hold a special place in my heart because it predominantly follows Isolde. She has been my absolute heart and joy from the first moment I met her on the page, and watching her growth in this book, I wept, I laughed, I will never be the same. Susan Dennard is such a masterful writer. This book, like the ones before it, is so chock full of action and character and all of this lovely goodness that makes high fantasy my favorite genre in the entire world. And it's an absolute feat of a novel because in inception, the contents of this book actually spanned 2 separate books, and she still managed to weave them into one very satisfying story with such deftness. This series is far from being like a hidden gem in that a bunch of people know it, but I still feel it's not as hyped as it deserves. So all I can do is stand here on my little pedestal and scream about this series in the hopes that at least one of you will pick it up and read it with me and enjoy this series before the conclusion with the final book. Question number 2 is, what is the best sequel that you've read so far this year? And I told myself at the start of filming this video that I wouldn't be repeating books, or at least I wouldn't to the best of my ability, because my gut instinct here is to say Witch Shadow, on account of, duh, it is a sequel, it's not the first of a series or a standalone. However, in terms of what I think a sequel ought to do, which is further expand a world, further give the motivations of characters, raise the stakes, etc. You've heard me talk about this at length before. My point is, as far as a sequel, like something that has all of the quintessential qualities of a sequel, I think there's a book that I've read this year that has even Witch Shadow beat, and that is The Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. This is the 2nd book of Robin Hobb's Live Ship Traders series, which is the 2nd series within the realm of the Elderling saga. This series follows the Vestrit family, and they are a group of traders from a port city known as Bingtown. Bingtown is a colony of a greater nation known as Jamalia that has more and more often been neglecting their colony, allowing certain parts of the charter that was signed at the inception of Bingtown to sort of slip. They're allowing slaves into land where there shouldn't have been slaves. They're allowing formerly aggressive nations to make more and more inroads towards this city. And the satrap, which is essentially the king of Jamalia, is allowing new traders to come in and settle on lands that should be, according to every right written in the books, belonging to native Bingtowners, people that arrived there first. To my knowledge, there wasn't anyone living in Bingtown. Robin Hobb certainly made no mention of them, or at least anyone living there at the time the settlers arrived. So when I say native Bingtowners, I mean the people that came over there first. The Vestrits are one of the oldest families of these traders, and they have what is known as a live ship, a ship made of wizard wood that once 3 generations of a family have died aboard its decks, the ship comes to life and basically becomes a living entity of its own. And the story opens with the Vestrits' 3rd generation man, the patriarch of his family, dying aboard decks, and follows what happens to each of the family members, both individually and as a collective unit from there. I really don't want to spoil anything that happens in this book, because I think that the end of book 1 and the entirety of the Mad Ship are something that's best to go into knowing as little about as possible and just let the magic of this world sweep you away. I thought Ship of Magic, which is the 1st book of this trilogy, did the most, and it did all of my favorite things as far as fantasy does. And I couldn't fathom how Robin Hobb would expand upon the world she built in there, but she did. character arcs and character interrelations have only gotten more and more complicated. Certain people that I found absolutely despicable ended up being some of my favorite characters by the end of this book. The Mad Ship is a masterpiece. Question number 3 is, what is a new release that you have not read yet but you want to? For this, I have to say Rise to the Sun by Leah Johnson. Leah Johnson is the author of You Should See Me in a Crown, which was one of my favorite books of last year. Now, I don't know much about Rise to the Sun, but I do know that I adore Leah Johnson's writing, and that if Rise to the Sun brings me what You Should See Me in a Crown brought me, which is just pure, concentrated, queer black girl joy, then I know that I'm gonna be sold. The way Leah Johnson writes character is just everything to me. In You Should See Me in a Crown, I was blown away by Liz's complexity. I really love protagonists who go, and Leah Johnson has proven to me already that she knows how to write people who take action and who stick to the principles that they have. So I hope to get more of that in Rise to the Sun. Question number 4 is, what is your most anticipated release for the second half of the year? I think it releases in September, and it's Iron Widow by Jiran J. Zhao. This is a queer, polyamorous, Pacific Rim inspired sci-fi that borrows inspiration from Chinese mythos and history, and I cannot wait to get my hands on a copy. Like, the impetus that sets off the action for the entirety of the book is a young woman trying to kill a man to avenge the death of her younger sister. And if that's not the most baller thing you've heard today, I don't know what is, but I would like to, so please let me know if there's a book that sounds even cooler than that that's coming out in the next half of the year so I can add it to my TBR real quick. Please and thank you. Question number 5 is, what is your most disappointing read for the year so far? And for this, unfortunately, I have to say 5 Dark Fates by Kendara Blake. This is the conclusion to the 3 Dark Crowns series, which is a fantasy series that I've absolutely loved basically from the start of my time on BookTube, potentially even before I was making videos. The story follows triplet queens Catherine, Arsinoe, and Mirabella, who each have powers based on one of several factions on an island named Fenburn. Mirabella controls the elements, Arsinoe is a naturalist, meaning she has like a bond with animals and nature and things. And Catherine is a poisoner, meaning she is immune to venoms and poisons and is also really deft at crafting her own. And the conceit is that only one queen can survive and become the next queen to carry on the family line. And the way she does this is by killing her sisters in like a year-long death match, basically. 5 Dark Fates concludes the story, and it technically did that. However, it did so in a way that felt kind of lackluster to me. There were so many interesting new threads and new expansions to the world that were brought up in book 3 that book 4 just kind of glossed over or dropped, specifically regarding the spirituality of the island and the dead queens that came before the 3 queens that we're following in this book. Trying to avoid spoilers as best as possible, one of these dead queens seemed to have a bond with one of the sisters, and in the 4th book, that bond turned out to be literally nothing. Like, we follow her in her belief that this is going to turn out to be an actual useful thing to the story and to the plot. We believe it, she believes it, everyone around her believes it, and then she goes up to figure it out, and then the story's like, oh yeah, this is actually nothing. That just felt like a bit of a slap in the face. I feel like if you are given the promise of story as a reader, then you are sort of owed the resolution to that story. And I feel like if you're gonna say this thing that you thought was super, super important actually turns out to be nothing, it has to be foreshadowed or at least indicated somehow previously that that's a possibility. I don't know, perhaps this series would have felt like it had concluded better if it had spanned another 5th book, because by the end of this one, it felt incredibly rushed, like things were happening just to happen, which was doubly jarring because this is a book that is full of slow build. So to have everything happen all at once and not happen well, I say well, what I mean is in a way that makes plot sense and also is given room to breathe on the page so that the reader can sit with the thing that's happened. It just disappointed me. That's all I really have to say about that. Question number 6 is, what is your biggest surprise of the year? And for me, this has to be Heir Apparent by Vivian van de Velde. How do I explain Heir Apparent? Perhaps by the feeling it gave me. This book felt nostalgic in the same way that like made for VHS or DVD 90s movies feel nostalgic. It gave me Pagemaster. It gave me The Princess Bride. It made me feel nostalgic for something that I hadn't experienced before. And make no mistake, it wasn't like a masterful book, right? It wasn't the best written thing I'd ever read, but it was kind of awesome. It follows a young girl named Jeanette who exists in a world like ours, but kind of different, where virtual reality games are a thing, and some super conservative folks are really up in arms about young kids playing games and the youth being corrupted by technologies outside of their understanding, you know the sort. So Jeanette goes into one of these like gaming stations, it's kind of like an arcade, and decides to play a game she'd never tried before called Heir Apparent. And while she is inside of this game, some protesters get inside the arcade and mess up some equipment, and she kind of gets stuck in there. And the only way to safely extract herself from the VR systems that are kind of implanted into her brain right now is to succeed and win this game. If she fails, she dies in the game and starts over. And game time is super fast compared to real life human time, but she only has about 4 hours of real life human time to succeed at this before the stuff in her head gives her like permanent brain damage. And so Jeanette has to play the heir apparent. She is the bastard daughter of a king, and upon the king's death, she's invited to become the heir in his household. There she has to contend with political intrigue from her stepmother and half-brothers, angsty mages, saints who demand poetry, peasant revolts, barbarian invasions, and one very, very scary dragon. And honestly, it's so much fun. This is one of those books that I will be revisiting over and over again. And I was super surprised as to how much I loved it, but I truly never heard anyone speak about it on BookTube. So if you're watching this, this is your sign. Pick up this book. It is so much fun. It is a tremendous amount of fun, and I would die for somebody to talk about it with. Prompt number 7 is, what is your favorite new or new to you author? I have 2 answers for this, both of which kind of shock me. The first is Natalie Diaz. Natalie Diaz is a queer indigenous Latina author who wrote the poetry collections When My Brother Was an Aztec and Post-Colonial Love Poem, both of which I've read like within the past month. I'm crazy picky when it comes to my poetry. It just doesn't hook me the same way that, standard prose does. But the way that Natalie Diaz writes about loving women is just, not everyone is always good at words per se, not even every writer. Like, I'm a writer, at least in theory, and I'm not always good at words. Natalie Diaz picks the perfect word for every perfect line in truly everything she writes. I have not read a poem by her that hasn't hit me in the chest and rattled me. If you're a fan of poetry, I highly, highly suggest picking her up. And the other favorite author, the book that got me really into him, was another one of his written in verse, and that is Jason Reynolds. This year, I finally picked up Long Way Down. I picked up the illustrated/graphic novel version. Speaking of having no words, I have no words for this book. It was a masterpiece. In the graphic novel version in particular, I was so struck by the interplay of the words and the images chosen to represent them. Long Way Down is a piece of art. It's an incredible and moving and thought-provoking story, and honestly, at this point, I trust Jason Reynolds to write literally anything. And if I'm not very much mistaken, he has written a Spider-Man book, and Spider-Man is my favorite superhero. So, that's just another point in his favor as far as I'm concerned. Prompt number 8 is, what is your newest fictional crush of the year? And honestly, I haven't really found one. I have one sort of one, and it's Piranesi from Susanna Clarke's Piranesi. I don't know how to describe this book, and I also don't feel like I would be doing you a service by describing this book. This is definitely one you just sort of need to go into and let it sweep you away. But the protagonist of this story is a 35-year-old researcher, and he is just such a soft, good bean. He's not broody, but he is romantic. Instead of being sarcastic, he's thoughtful and kind. He lives a simple life and is so fascinated and in love with the world around him. And honestly, I just want to protect him. I just want to hang out with him and be buds with him and maybe smooch him a little. I don't know, I feel like smooching him is kind of gross because I just want to protect him. He's a little baby, he's a little bean. He's not my favorite fictional crush or a fictional crush at all, so much as he's just somebody I'd really like to be pals with. Prompt number 9 is, what is a book that made you cry this year? And that has to go hands down to Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Chanel Miller is the heretofore anonymous victim of the Stanford sexual assault case from a couple years back. Because of how long these proceedings took and because of the intense trauma that she suffered, for a very long time she was not allowed to voice her story. And in Know My Name, she's finally given a platform to speak and explain what happened to her and why it was wrong. I felt so many things while reading this book, and I cried for most of them. The grief, the rage, and the quiet and triumphant moments of joy as well. And I don't want to go into detail beyond that, so let it suffice to say, me too. Pivoting to prompt number 10, what is a book that made you happy? And that is Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas. Aidan Thomas is the author of Cemetery Boys, which was another one of my favorites from last year. And when they announced that their sophomore novel was going to be a retelling of Peter Pan, which you guys know is my favorite book of all time, Instantly had to have it. This book follows Wendy Darling, a high school senior in a small town in Oregon. 5 years ago, she and her two brothers, John and Michael, went missing, and only Wendy came back. She had no memory of where she and her brothers went or what happened to them, and is trying to move on despite the grief that is still holding her and her family down. But when children in her town begin to go missing again, similarly to how she and her brothers did all those years ago, the police come to Wendy's door looking for answers, because who else is going to give them a lead on this? And in the middle of a panic spiral, Wendy goes on a drive and almost hits a young man lying in the middle of the road who is lacking a shadow. And before her, she finds Peter, a young boy that she thought only existed in the stories that she used to tell her little brothers. And he asks her for help in locating the missing children. And the story kicks off from there. I will read anything that is even remotely associated to Peter Pan. You know this. And I will read anything that Aiden Thomas ever puts out. So these two things put together just put an enormous smile on my face. I'm always fascinated in what sort of dynamics people take away from the Peter-Wendy relationship from J.M. Barrie's story. And the dynamic that Aiden Thomas wrote just made me smile so much. Despite it being a tougher story in that it deals a lot with grief and fear and trauma, it isn't all dark. And much like the Peter Pan stories, there's always room for levity and laughter and childlike wonder and joy. Prompt number 11 is, what is the most beautiful book that you've bought or that has been given to you so far this year? And for this, I think, without a doubt, I have to say Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. It has some of my favorite elements of pretty book covers in that it has symmetry, it has some pretty sharp and crisp line work, and it's also chock full of color. I think overall it's very dynamic and all parts of it draw your eye in a very sequential way, which I really enjoy. And a sort of like sneaky honorable mention goes to Mr. Impossible by Maggie Stiefvater. I am not a fan of the standard cover, but this sort of dust jacket that Maggie Stiefvater has illustrated with the fruit and the key and the red, all of this is, I think, gorgeous. And prompt number 12, do you have any books that you need to read before the end of the year? So many, as always, but we're gonna say Gods of Jade and Shadow, Mr. Impossible, and finally Tokyo Ever After by Emma Kojin. Because this is an arc, I do want to get to it as soon as possible. And there you have it, folks. That is the contents of my mid-year book freakout tag. Let me put these down. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave me a thumbs up. And if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to my channel. I post videos every weekend, and I'd love to have you join my little bookish family. If you'd like to see more bookish content from me, all of my socials are linked in the description box below. You can find me on Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter. But for now, that's it for me. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video very soon. Goodbye.